Thank you, Benjamin, for agreeing to sit down with me for this interview. Maybe you can start by introducing yourself, giving a quick recap on who you are, what you do, and just start by giving like a short elevator pitch on who you are.
Sure. So my name is Benjamin Dierker. I'm the executive director of the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure. We are the only infrastructure-focused think tank in the United States, and our work really centers around advancing innovation across both industry and public policy to see safer, more efficient, and resilient infrastructure in the United States. Um, I personally studied economics and then did a master's in public policy, and then went to law school so that I could really focus on that intersection of economics, law, and policy for how our infrastructure systems are built, maintained, and upgraded, and then really to help policymakers and industry leaders find clear roadmaps for resolving issues.
Awesome, awesome. Maybe you can start with telling me a bit more about what's the one thing you've learned about America's infrastructure while you have been in your current position. I'm pretty sure there must have been a lot you've learned, but
Yeah.
what's one of the highlights?
I think one of the highlights is learning how interconnected all of our infrastructure systems are, and
Mhm.
not just how interconnected they are with one another, but how interconnected our modern daily lives are with those systems. Things we don't actually think about, you know, day to
Yeah,
day, but that are absolutely critical and crucial to just the light flip, flipping the light switch and light coming on, or flushing a toilet and that waste going somewhere.
yeah.
Um, I think when it comes to kind of the broader infrastructure landscape, how all the different systems are interconnected, the key there for me is we often work with policymakers or people who want to implement solutions, but they don't necessarily know the downstream effects of what they want to do or the upstream challenges to putting that thing in place.
Yeah.
So if it's something like increasing the capacity on the energy grid, and somebody says, let's add more wind or solar capacity, the interconnected piece there is seeing you might have land use issues that involve eminent domain just to get the land to put that new energy project on. You might have supply chain challenges to get the raw materials. You then have different regulatory challenges to get the transmission lines built. And it's all these different layers just to get power added to the grid. And that's before any consumer ever sees the power at their home, business, or office.
Awesome. There's a lot to unpack here, and maybe we can take a step back and talk about the infrastructure system as you mentioned it. When people think about the infrastructure system, like for example myself, I think about roads and power lines, and that's about it. But I can
Yeah.
imagine it's much more complicated or complex than that. So, um, What's the mix of the infrastructure system like in the United States? Maybe you can break it down and then we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah. I think, like you said, people think about roads and bridges or they think about power lines because those are
Yeah.
visible. They might see or use them on a daily basis. Um, at AII, the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure, we focus on as broad of a definition of infrastructure as possible. But for us, it's still grounded in a physical system or structure. There's a lot of people who will use rhetorical things like human infrastructure or things like that to describe
Yeah.
kind of a system of organization, which is important. And we do frame things like that, but really we're looking at the physical pipes, cables, and wires, and physical buildings and structures. So, the energy grid, it is electrical lines, but it's upstream, producing that power at a power plant or wind or solar farm. It's the transmission lines that are high voltage, taking that power long distance, and it's the distribution lines. So even just in you know, power lines, there's actually different classifications. Same for pipelines, underground, so you don't think about it, but upstream, um, gathering lines and things like that. You have transmission lines, you have distribution lines. There's other types of pipe for water, for carbon dioxide, for waste. And then you have things like data centers
Yeah.
and server farms that are powering things like the internet. There's fiber optic cable. Um, you can really pick anything that you can see in the world, and there is a broad set of infrastructure supporting it. The building itself, the roadways to get there, all the underground pipes, cables, and wires. Um, and you can really multiply that by 10 or 1,000 because, like I said, everything's so interconnected. And so we would even include some of the components that support infrastructure in that, airports, and to some extent the trucks, the airplanes, the railroad cars themselves are they're using the infrastructure. So the physical infrastructure is the railroad track, the road, the airport facility, but the conveyances, the actual trucks, all those things are kind of a infrastructure light or they're infrastructure plus. And so that's critical to understanding port facilities are another, because these are all our supply chain, how it works. It's all underpinned by infrastructure, but then the use of it is how that infrastructure gets built and maintained. And then ultimately, if you're not thinking about supply chains and the physical infrastructure, you're not going to have groceries at the store. And so it's all really interconnected, and it gets even more interconnected the further down the rabbit hole you go, which is fun. There's an endless amount of things to research and study and promote and do education on. So it'll keep us busy for a lifetime.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, it sounds like you're really into infrastructure, like really obsessed about it. It's
It didn't start out that way, but the more you learn, the more intriguing it
yeah.
is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. But my question would be, so your name is about innovation and infrastructure, or like your think tank. And I'm just wondering, like, what kind of innovation do you guys want to see when it comes to infrastructure? Maybe you can talk about one of your successes you've had,
Yep.
uh, or maybe a big vision you're working towards. Like, I leave it up to you how you want to break it
Sure.
down.
Yeah, so we ultimately want to see innovation in both private industry, the
Hmm.
actual markets and the actual roads and bridges and things like that, but also in public policy. So we want to see innovation in how we think about the rules and regulations, and also we want to see those rules and regulations actually encourage more innovation. So we want to create this cyclical effect where in the private industry, people are being innovative. They're being entrepreneurs. They're trying new things. A lot of R&D, a lot of technology adoption, implementing best practices, and really just trying to drive forward. And then on the policy side, we want to see, both legislative and regulatory changes that um, identify an issue. So one big issue on the policy side is prescriptive regulations that try to define what or how to do something because over time people think if we tell industry how to operate, it'll be safe because we know this is safe. And so we want to see the regulatory code shift more to performance oriented objectives, achieve this outcome and then let entrepreneurs and innovators try new things that do achieve that outcome. So you don't lose safety, you don't lose efficiency. You still get what the regulation was intended to do, but without detailing how they do it, because that just puts a box around them. It discourages innovation. So on the technology side, we want to see artificial intelligence. We want to see drones used for things like inspections of railroad tracks, of roads, of bridges, and there's tons of innovation happening out there where you can basically see things that the human eye can't see on railroad tracks for deficiencies or cracks in a bridge that we would never be able to see as inspectors visually, but technology can do it for us. We want to see a lot more of that. In the energy space, there's companies stripping carbon out of natural gas before you combust it. So it's actually a non-CO2 way to do energy. And then you have carbon as a physical asset you can build into infrastructure. Super cool things on that front. And then back to the policy side, you know, whenever you have things like I mentioned the bridge example where we can't see some of the deficiencies, we'd love to see policies shift from detailing, a human inspector walks along this and visually inspects to, you know, inspections are achieved at whatever frequency. And I don't know how it should be phrased exactly, but ultimately unlocking the ability for innovation to go into place without telling them fire the inspectors. I mean, there's a role for humans in all of this. We want technology to be a complement, but we don't want the regulation to say it should be people or it must be technology. We want it to be performance oriented. And we've seen movement on that. I mean, I think there's been recent rules proposed and rescinded that we've weighed in on at the Federal Railroad Administration and elsewhere. Um, and tons of people talk about our work in peer-reviewed journals or in textbooks and things like that. So we're seeing people think more innovatively about policy and industry things. But a lot of public policy changes are really slow. AII has been around for over a decade now, but that's about the timeline it takes to move any policy forward. And so, we've seen quick and small wins, but I think it's going to take, an infrastructure think tank being around for 20, 30 years before you really see some of those big shifts in regulatory culture. But we're proud to be able to promote industries that are doing innovative work. We're proud to partner with, our funders certainly, but really anyone who's doing innovation and trying to achieve our shared vision, which is ultimately safer, more efficient, more resilient infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. My question would be, what's your biggest success story to date? I mean, you gave some great examples, whether it's the drones inspecting railway lines or bridges, but
Yeah.
just out of curiosity, if you had to pinpoint one great success story that you've achieved over the last decade, what would it be? And why do you think it's going to make such a big impact on the future of infrastructure, especially in America?
Yeah, like I said, kind of within only operating for 10 years, it's difficult to see those big giant wins. Certainly, we've weighed in on smaller scale things like um, we're an independent third party, so we're not advocating for individual companies or things like that. But where we see infrastructure projects that need to be pushed forward, or we see restraints on infrastructure projects that need to be removed, we certainly weigh in on those. And so we've certainly seen, projects permitting approved and things like that where we've weighed in. Um, we've seen agencies move forward with approving waivers for companies that were trying to implement innovative technology. Um, and then I would say just another win for us is being cited in things like textbooks, cited in congressional um, research reports. We're called on for background requests by Congress and federal agencies. Those are huge successes for us, even if they don't, they're not visible publicly. But we know we're moving the needle because we're actually helping educate policymakers directly, and we're helping, create the right research and educational resources that do ultimately shift that culture forward. And as an independent third party, um, we have the credibility to say, look, we're the only infrastructure think tank, and we're independent and objective. We're nonpartisan, and this is the way to promote innovation in infrastructure. Remove some barriers, add smarter regulation, and people have responded to that. So that's a huge success from our perspective.
Great, great. So on the education side, I actually checked out your website and I saw that you have a lot of one-pagers, whether it's about eminent domain or other concepts that are relevant to infrastructure. And I can imagine when you're dealing with policymakers, they might not necessarily have a background in infrastructure, or they might not have the time to really dive deep into the nitty-gritty parts of it. So when it comes to the bits on educating policymakers or the public, like what do you focus on? Like, what's your mission? How do you go from taking something that is very complex and making it very easy to digest and understand for someone sitting in Congress or someone who is having to make a decision on policies? What's your guiding post here?
Yeah, I think the first thing I think is policymakers are just people. I mean,
Yeah,
they're not a special class of person.
yeah,
Um, they're in a position where they're helping, serve the public and serve our nation's needs. That's a huge, high, and noble calling. Um, but they are just people. I mean, they're citizens like all of us who wanted to serve, and so they stepped into this role. A lot of them are doctors or lawyers or small business owners, parents. So are we. I mean, So we start with recognizing who our audience is. There
Yeah.
are people who are wanting to serve but don't necessarily know all the things that they need, and so it's trying to equip them the same way we would equip our parents or our friends and family. Um, Give them information that doesn't overcomplicate it, but does condense those complex ideas into manageable bite-sized things. Some of that comes down to formatting, honestly. If you can use bullet points instead of big paragraphs, it's just easier to read. Another is knowing that they're busy, they're pressed for time. So you can't put a 10-page paper, much less a 50-page paper, in front of them. Those are needed resources, and we obviously create long reports that dive deep into complex topics. But that's really for their staff and others to digest, other think tanks, um, and to cite and reference as they do their own work. So when we pursue policymaker education, it really focuses on short, readable, formatted content that takes the big top line items that they do really need to know. Um, you mentioned the one pagers. One of the things that people have really responded to is that we have a point and counterpoint section where it lists a bullet point for an idea relevant to that infrastructure topic, and then kind of the countervailing argument. It's not myth versus fact, it's not true and false. It's really true statements that one side would voice it this way, and another side would say, well, have you thought about this? And so for a policymaker, that's a really good nonpartisan resource because it's not saying, here's how private business would do it, and this is the right way. It's not saying, here's environmental considerations. It's really all of those packaged into one. So they can kind of get this, and it's almost like a full briefing in a one-page document. Um, and that's been really helpful. And if they do want more information, we kind of leave them wanting more. Um, if it's really intriguing and answers a lot of questions, they're going to come back and ask questions, and that's the best thing for policymaker education because then they're engaged at that level and they're pursuing the information. If you're trying to push forward too much to them, then it almost looks like lobbying. You're trying to push an agenda on them. Our agenda is research topics, educate, and do outreach, and then let the good quality information guide the discussion moving forward.
Awesome, awesome. So what I'm understanding from here is that you're trying to be very neutral, not trying to aim for trying to force an agenda, but trying to more lean towards education. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. There's nobody else in the infrastructure think tank space. So it's critical that we be nonpartisan and bipartisan when needed. But infrastructure serves everyone, and we need infrastructure, and we're going to need more infrastructure. And if it becomes a political or a partisan or an agenda-driven issue, one, people are going to be skeptical of it, and two, it's not going to work as well. You're going to have coalitions that support it or some that are against it. And so to be the most big tent possible to have more people want to support us, but also to trust our work. It's really important to be nonpartisan, be independent, and be really objective with our analysis of things.
Yeah, that is a good point because when people think about think tanks, they mostly feel like that they are representing corporate interests, that,
Yeah.
they are funded by big corporations. But that's not the case for you, I'm guessing, because I've seen your website. I've seen that you have special opportunities for funding, that you
Mhm.
guys solicit donations. So you're completely independent in that regard. You don't get funding from big corporations, or you're trying to represent corporations in that
Yeah.
sense, right?
No, that's exactly right. And our funding base is really everyone who builds, maintains, or uses infrastructure. And so we're kind of funded by the people who rely on infrastructure, which is everyone. I mean, that's the important thing. And so, we would take funding from a corporation, but the thing is, we're not going to be a mouthpiece for anyone. We're going to understand and evaluate the infrastructure needs and then produce objective content about it. And so we have an insulated process for that where no one or group of funders can drive our agenda. That does start with us thinking of ideas ourselves and pitching that to funders rather than them all coming to us and saying, "Hey, we want you to fund, or we want to fund this and have you do this." We don't operate that way. So we have a lot of ways to collect feedback and issue prioritization from our partners, from our funders, but also the public. We use surveys for that and things, and so then we get a lot of feedback about what important areas need to be studied, what policy issues there are, what infrastructure challenges there are. We have an independent advisory council that also takes that information in and gives us advice. And then, of course, we track the news and current events and developments like, a wildfire in California or aviation incident. And so we react in real time as well. But all of that is based on the needs of our infrastructure and where education is needed.
All right then. Thank you, Benjamin. No more questions from my side. That was a very informative discussion.
I appreciate it. If anybody has more questions or would like to learn more, aii.org is where you'll find that information.